Did you ever have a feeling that you wanted to go and still have a feeling that you wanted to stay? Did you ever have a feeling that you wanted to go and still have a feeling that you wanted to stay? Did you ever have a feeling that you wanted to go and still have a feeling that you wanted to stay?
Let's talk about the new EaganMatrix Additive Synth Bank. This is new to version 9.0 firmware and allows the user to manipulate in various ways up to 96 sine wave components of an additive analysis dataset that's installed in Flash. Now this dataset is specially processed to allow this manipulation, and it's more filtering and sine wave component morphing than allowing you to specify a number of sine wave components at different amplitudes and frequencies and add them together. A short list here shows you the operations that can be performed. You can index into this analysis set, which is kind of like a sample data set from one viewpoint. You can change the center sine wave component that you're operating on. You can manipulate frequencies of the sine wave component both in a linear and quadratic fashion. You can manipulate the amplitudes in various ways of the sine wave components. You can perform spectral dilation, and you can also control the bandwidth for noise modulation of sine wave components. Let's take a look at what's actually going on in Flash. Two sets of storage have been defined here. The first one is fixed, and that's what's available in the 9.0 firmware release. Basically, it's the Malling phrase that's been installed, converted into this format where you can manipulate the sine waves, and all the operations I just talked about can be performed on this data set. Now, coming up in future releases, not sure exactly when, but there's also a user set of storage equivalent to the 19.2 second storage that is used for the Malling phrase. That is broken up in the user set into 1.92 second buffers, and a tool is going to be available to allow you to load your own wave files that will be created into this analysis format, and you can manipulate each one of these data sets in the similar way that you can with the Malling phrase. And you'll be able to group some of these buffers together to create larger data sets than 1.92 seconds if you wish. Now there are a couple limitations. On LX1 continuums, single DSP continuums, you'll have to use a max polyphony of 2. And if you have a single processor continuum, you'll only be able to use one of the two possible additive synth banks. For LX2 and above users, you can use two additive banks at a time. On a single DSP continuum, you may also have some DSP limitations if you try and create presets that have an additive bank and a lot of extra resources as well. You'll have to play that by ear. On the expanded continuums, you'll have less to worry about there, and you can use a max polyphony of 4. So that's the basic structure of what's going on. Right now, all you can do is manipulate the Malling phrase, but you'll see that you can do a lot of stuff with just that. So I've connected up my Continuum Mini, which is a 2 DSP device. I've set my additive synth bank, and I'll start by just using two of the parameters, the frequency parameter and the index parameter. For right now, I'll set a fixed frequency of 220 Hz, and the index parameter allows you to move through the additive analysis set in various ways with shape generators. Or if you like, you can set it to a fixed value if you want to get a snapshot of the spectral component at that point. What we'll do is we'll ramp through the entire Malling set, which is an index of 0 to 1. If you ramp through higher than that, you can go into the user data area, but as we said, that's not available yet. As it turns out, you really want to ramp from 0.01 to 0.99 and not use 0 or 1. The reason is at 0, no sound comes out, and at 1, you can get some noise. What I've done is used a shape generator with a frequency that maps to 19.2 seconds. And I'm ramping that from 0.01 to 0.99. And what happens if I press my fingerboard?
Did you ever have a feeling that you wanted to go and still have a feeling that you wanted to stay?
I ramp through that entire set this way. And you might think of this like sample manipulation in this regard. If I like, I can make this faster. Let's make it 0.1 instead of this value, and you'll see the phrase will be played faster.
Did you ever have a feeling that you want?
If I want, I can go and take this shape generator and ramp it from the max value down. So let's do a ramp down, and it should be playing itself backwards now. And you can mix shape generators on this to create interesting variants of the pattern if you like as well. Of course, I don't have to set it to a fixed frequency. I could set it to X and play the phrase. There, I've created my own language. Other things you can do, in this case, I've set up a sample and hold to sample noise in a range that makes sense to index, and I've set a formula that uses that sample and hold. And now I should, at the data rate of my shape generator, change to random points in the phrase. Obviously, it doesn't sound like the mauling phrase anymore, and I could set that to be slower or faster in terms of the shape generator. Or one thing I could do is use my X component frequency, and now I'll set this to just some fixed value in the index. So I'm going to take a snapshot of my additive sample set at that point, and it will play like an instrument. Certain points in this phrase are almost silent, so depending upon what value I use, I can get different sounds coming out based on where I am in this additive sample. They're much quieter because I'm probably in one of those places between where the voice is at max amplitude and not. So you can do this for any of these user sample sets, hopefully, in future. Here's an example using two additive synth banks, which you can do if you have two or more DSPs in your continuum. Here I created another additive synth running through the data set at a different rate. What we can do is maybe take one of these and put it at a fixed rate, and now you should hear two of the modeling sets, one at a fixed frequency and one that I can change with X at a higher frequency.
Did you ever have a feeling that you wanted?
I can make them both trigger off of X if I like.
Did you ever have a feeling that you wanted to go?
I can even modulate one with another, which we'll do a little bit later. So now let's look at the remaining parameters that can control the additive synth set. What I've done is create barrels and gens and put them on all the parameters so I can easily control them using my Kenton as we go through the list here. First off, I put a barrel on the index so that I can easily scroll the sound at a fixed point. This is to get a sound that I want to use for the base of my manipulations. Now, if I scroll through this quickly, obviously I can do pretty much what I did with my shape generator. So let's set it to a sound that's relatively loud in volume. The first parameter we'll look at is the frequency spread. This is set to a value of -1 to +1. If you are in the positive area, you will increase the spacing of the sine tone components. And if you're in the negative area, you will decrease the spacing. So this works very much like the frequency spread that's used on one of the quadratic filter banks. So there's our spectrum analyzer. Let me play a tone. You can see the sine tone components. And now let's increase the frequency spread. You can see the sine tone components going further and further apart there. And as you increase, you can get inharmonic sounds, you can get a frequency spread that comes a little more back into harmonic stability. And if we continue to increase the spread, you'll get to a point where those sine tones get so far apart, they will basically disappear. Let's bring them back. And we'll move in the opposite direction, crunching them all together. And at a certain point, they'll converge on the fundamental. You can get to a point there where they're so close they're beating. And there we're back to the fundamental. A similar thing will happen if you use quadratic frequency spread. The rate at which they change will be different, of course, with quadratic function versus linear. Pretty similar to what you'll do with the filter banks with the same frequency spread parameter. Let's look at the amplitude controls for the sine tone components now. There are 4 of them: spread amplitude, quadratic split amplitude, prune amplitude, and amplitude interpolation index. These work in conjunction with a center control. The center specifies which of the 96 possible sine wave components of your data set is used as the base for the manipulation. If it's set to 0, which it is now, the minimum value, your fundamental is your center. The control I have on the center is set with a barrel that's quantized to 0.01, so I can dial through the full range of sine wave components to set center. Let's look at the spread amplitude function first. This, when set greater than 0, reduces the amplitude of the sine wave components farther from the center we just talked about. I set this to go from 0 to 10. You can set this to greater than 1 if you want to drastically compress those amplitudes. We'll set it to its minimum to begin with. Now the fundamental is the center, so it's going to use that as the base point for doing the amplitude spread. I set this down an octave so I can see more overtones. Let's decrease the amplitudes now. And you can hear they're decreasing from that fundamental. If I want, I can change this to a range of 100, and that will make them decrease even further. You can really see at this value I can drastically limit those amplitudes. And you can use a range that suits your needs there. If I use quadratic instead of linear, we're going to get a similar function. We'll set center to be not the fundamental, but something higher. And you can see the change is a little different because my center now is in the middle and not on the fundamental, which is not amplified. So you can play around with the center value with these two amplitude spreads to change the amplitude component of your analysis set, but it's all done pretty much as a group like it is on the frequency spread. The pruning function lets you dial in to a much finer degree to specific sine tone components for manipulation. The prune component is actually my favorite operation on the additive set. This specifies how many sine wave components to play. 0 for 1 up to the max of 0.95, starting at the sine component specified by the center column. So here center works very much in conjunction with the pruning. I set center to be the min, which means the fundamental is the center. So we'll start pruning from the fundamental. My barrel on the pruning now quantizes so I can dial in each sine tone component. Let's set that to max, which would be all of them, and I will dial them down and you see what happens. I can dial them all the way down to 1 and then bring them in one at a time. This is kind of exciting because it really lets me dial in specific sine tones, but I can't dial in just any random set of them. I'll show you a way to deal with that later. So let's bring in a few more. And now let me change the center control. You can see that as I bring the center up, that's the starting point for my pruning. So it lets me selectively delete lower harmonics and higher ones, depending upon how many sine tones I specified to come in. There, I'm pruning high with center set pretty high, and I'll bring in all the frequencies from that point on. You can see that this is exciting and really fantastic function that will let you do a lot of harmonic manipulation, especially when we're able to download our own analysis sets. The final operation for amplitude control of your sine wave components is amplitude interpolation index. I haven't played around as much with this one. For this, you select two indices, one in your I column that you've done before, and another one in I prime that you set to some value. Here I've set to the same value in I, but I've offset it just a little bit in the positive direction. So I and I prime are not that far apart in the analysis set. And the C column is used for an interpolation control. When C is set to 0, it's set to I, so you won't have any interpolation going on. And when C is set to max, it's set to I prime, so it will interpolate between the two full values, I and I prime. Let's see what happens when we do that. It's a subtle effect. We'll dial down the center. And now I'm going to dial up the center control. That will increase the interpolation between the original index and the I prime we specified. It seems to have the effect of decreasing the overall amplitude shape. So you can get some very fine changes in your sound by doing this. The next parameter is spectral dilation. 0 means no change to spectral envelope. Greater than 0 stretches and less than 0 compresses. Let's see what that really means. I've set up a gen here that will let me go in the positive and negative directions, +1 to -1. We'll play a tone. And I'll bring spectral dilation from 0 to 1. You can see the higher harmonics are attenuated and the lower ones are amplified. If I go in the opposite direction, the opposite will occur. You can see the higher harmonics are amplified and the lower ones are attenuated. So we have a shape that kind of looks like this, where if you go in the positive direction, you're going to amplify the low end, and the high end will kind of drop out, and the reverse will happen if you go in the negative direction. The only thing to be aware of is that in the 9.0 firmware, at least, when you get to -1, the sound kicks out, but you can go past +1 to even further emphasize the plus direction. The final parameter in the additive bank is this bandwidth control. Let's read what the manual says here. The bandwidth noise modulation threshold, what B stands for, when a sine wave's component amplitude envelope drops below this threshold, it will be amplitude modulated by the additive's first column. 0 prevents modulation, 1 modulates all components, and less than 0 reverses the sense of the threshold. Only components with amplitude envelope above the negative threshold are modulated. Let's try and get our head around this one. First off, if you don't want to use this, make sure that you have nothing set in the bandwidth column, because even if you don't apply any modulation to the little first triangle column, you're still going to affect the sound if the bandwidth is set to anything greater than 0. Let's turn it on, and this bandwidth control is an arbitrary value. It's not based on some dB value that you can easily look up and figure out what's going on. You have to experiment with it a bit. For the sound that I'm dealing with here, the full range of bandwidth control only goes up in the positive direction to 0.074. So this might go a little bit higher, might go a little bit lower based on the overall amplitude map for your sound, but this is generally not going to be a very large value. Now, one of the nice things we can do with this is if I don't put anything in the initial modulation column, but I set the bandwidth to a value, when it kicks in, it'll try and modulate by 0. and that will effectively remove the harmonic content of whatever spectra it's working on at that time. And that will allow us to prune amplitudes based on this bandwidth value, as opposed to the prune function where we prune them based on the sine tone number. Okay, so here's a sound. Let's freeze it, and this is a snapshot, so the real values will move around. Let's take a look at where the amplitudes of the harmonic content lie. The highest ones appear to be on the third and the fourth harmonics, then maybe the fifth, the ninth, then the first couple, then a few in the middle, and after that they kind of progressively attenuate. Now when I kick in that bandwidth threshold, it's going to eliminate all the amplitudes that are lower than that threshold. So as I move the threshold higher, I should start eliminating these based on the amplitude of the harmonics. And at the end, I should have these three in the middle remaining, and all the others should be gone. And then I can move it up higher and further remove them. Here's our sound, and I'll bring up the bandwidth. There you can see the lower ones are starting to kick out. Again, the lower ones are being removed. And here I have it to a point where only the two higher ones remain. And I can dial it down even more until only one is left. A very nice way of further manipulating the spectral content of an additive sound. Let's try going in the opposite direction now. So here I've set my formula so that when I increase my gen, I'm going to go negative. Now when we start, because we're moving in the opposite direction, I don't hear anything, and as I bring up my bandwidth, the lower amplitude harmonics are going to come in first. You can get some very nice sounds this way. And of course I could put a shape generator on this and do stuff like this. Very nice. Again, as I move up that bandwidth in the opposite direction, the lower amplitude harmonics are coming in, not frequency, until I can bring them all in. So that's how the bandwidth operates on the amplitudes of your sine tones. The only thing left, if we just don't want to do amplitude pruning, is to bring in a modulation that's based on what we just saw. So let's take a look at a practical application that we can do here. You can do so many wonderful things in terms of applying this amplitude modulation to the additive bank. What I've done is just create a fixed sine tone at 5 Hertz, and I'll apply that with the W formula to come in at full amplitude as a modulator to my additive bank. You'll see this will let me selectively modulate certain harmonic components of the sound, which is extremely cool. Let's play our sound and then we'll bring up the modulation. I'm not really modulating anything much because I'm beneath the threshold. There I can start to see some of the harmonics starting to oscillate based on that sine tone. And as more of them come in, I can hear more of that oscillation. But you can hear the higher harmonics, those third and the fourth ones in there, are still not affected yet. Until I can bring the threshold above everything, and everybody's modulating now. And I can change that to maybe a little different waveform. That's even more pronounced. You can hear the one tone in there hasn't modulated yet. There, everything's modulating except two tones. I think you get the idea, and we could apply that in the opposite direction where I could start modulating the higher amplitudes first, and of course I could amplitude modulate with anything I like. I could amplitude modulate an additive bank with another additive bank. All kinds of wonderful things you can do. We've seen with the additive bank that we can manipulate groups of these analysis set sine tones. What if we want to also, in conjunction with that, amplify or decrease the amplitude of specific harmonic spectra? Well, one thing we can do is take the output of the additive bank and throw it as an input to the BIC mode, where I can define a graph of up to 48 mode amplitudes. And I can tailor the amplitudes of that to match an initial gain profile that I want. And from there I can pull them up or down, changing their amplitude in relation to the additive amplification that's already there. Let's start by just playing the bass additive synth tone. Now we'll turn off the additive bank going to the SL/SR outputs, and we'll throw that as an input to the BIC mode and send the output of the BIC mode in bank B to SL/SR. I'll set the frequency that I'm acting upon in the BIC mode to be the same frequency I'm playing in my additive synth. I'll set the frequency spread to the default harmonic spacing, and then I'll play a little bit around with the bandwidth. Not setting it too low because I don't want to over resonate, but setting it a little bit on the low side so that my changes in the mode amplitude graph are easily heard. Let's bring up our spectrum analysis tool and see what's going on. So let's say I want this second harmonic, just the second one, to be amplified. That I can't do in the additive bank. What I'll do here, though, is I'll take the second mode amplitude and I'll raise it to the max. Now when I go back to my graph, notice where that second harmonic is here. We'll turn it on. And you can see I can manipulate individual amplitudes of these modes, or in this case the sine tone components, using this BIC mode. Now let's say I want to really lower the first two even harmonics, and I'll raise the odd ones up a bit. There we go. The two even harmonics are lowered, and the fundamental and the third harmonic, the first two odd ones, are raised. This is pretty cool. This combination of using the additive synth morphing techniques that we've talked about in conjunction with specific control of the mode amplitudes going through the BIC mode lets me pretty much create any harmonic combination I can think of. So that kind of rounds out the use of the additive bank. This only scratches the surface, but gives you a pretty good understanding of the functions of the additive bank and gives you a little bit of an idea of how that can be used in conjunction with other facilities in the EaganMatrix as well.